We've finally managed to get things rolling again. Cool. Okay. So, I guess we probably want to start this stream again. I don't think the previous one was captured and stored as a past broadcast, so we're going to start from scratch. This stream is designed long term to hopefully get you started, you being the viewer, learning Rails. So the frame of reference I'm hoping you guys are coming from is that you want to learn a little bit of programming, you want to learn how to do some web app stuff. That's what I'll be intending to at least try and teach you. I'm not going to go through installation of Ruby and Rails, and if you want to install Redis and MySQL and all of those kinds of things. There are lots of tutorials out there, and to be quite honest, everyone's computer is going to be a little different, and me trying to present to you how to install that kind of stuff, time will be wasted. So I implore you to go out and install a Ruby version. Let's use 2.2.3. It can be pretty much any Ruby version past 2. There are slight differences. It doesn't matter a whole lot though, because we won't be utilizing a lot of the differences. So just anything Ruby 2 would be perfect. You'll want your command line, your terminal. I use iterm2, that's on OS X. For Linux guys, you can use whatever shell you're comfortable in. For Windows people, doing Ruby and Rails on Windows is kind of a pain in the ass, but CMD is great for just the really quick and easy shit that you need to do. If you need something a little bit more robust, you'll probably have to look into it yourself, because quite honestly I don't do a lot of Ruby coding on Windows. I primarily use OS X because that's what I do at work. It's a personal choice. We can argue all day about it, and then what language is better, and then what IDE is better. So I won't go spouting anything about that right now. Anyway, so let's pretty much rip straight into it. Ruby is a pretty easy language to learn. I think it's one of the easier ones. It reads and writes quite similar to English, or I think probably one of the most similar to English, unless you're doing something like the Shakespeare language. You go and look it up if you're interested. It's kind of cool. Without spouting too many techno jargon terms at you, it's loosely typed, which means that you don't have to do a whole lot of boilerplate. You don't have to do a lot of messing around and pre-declaring too much stuff. It is not functional, which means that you can pretty much type things and they happen as you type them, and there are things called side effects, and there's a whole lot of arguments as to why you should and shouldn't use functional languages, but suffice to say, it is a type of language that most languages are similar to, and it's probably one that fits the human brain in a way that we think, at least when we're first learning coding. So I won't go too much further into describing the exact nature of Ruby. Suffice to say, it is a language quite heavily used professionally and for hobbyists, and probably the primary usage of it is for the Rails framework, which is fantastic. Personally, I think the gold standard for web frameworks, again, something that can be argued for eons and epochs. So, Ruby. Now, jump into your command prompt, and what we're going to do is use something called IRB, which comes with Ruby. It's an interactive Ruby shell, if you will. It lets you write Ruby on the fly and have it interpreted on the fly. So what you want to do is come into some directory. I've created one and just type IRB and press enter. And what we get presented with is a Ruby shell, which means we can start typing any Ruby that we want. So what are we going to do? Well, first, let's talk a little bit about this thing called primitives, and primitives are basically Ruby's representation of the most commonly used things in programming. So strings, which are sequences of letters and numbers and symbols, pretty much anything that you can type on the keyboard, you can put in a string. And that looks something like this. It's a quote or a double quote, depending on what you're doing, but for now we'll just use single quote. And it's a sequence of numbers or letters or anything you can type on the keyboard. So let's use my name, Jason. And then you press enter, and it's returning it to you. But we can ignore that for the minute. We have here a string with the value Jason, and it is a primitive. So if we go Jason, and then we type dot and type class, press enter, that returns the class of the string Jason, and that is the string primitive in Ruby. Ignore this for the minute. The point is that this is a string, so it's how you would store text. There are other primitives. There is fixed num, or as you might have heard it in math, integer. So 1, 2, 3, press enter, get the value back, and if you type class, you get fixed num, and fixed num is a primitive in Ruby. And then probably the other ones that you'll want to know about are, well, something like pi is a float because it has a decimal point. That's, the other kind of mathematical representation. There are more and more complicated ones. We won't get into those because you don't need to know about them right now. The other two that you'll probably encounter, actually three that you'll encounter, is one called a symbol, which is kind of similar to a string. However, it has some interesting properties that are not really worth mentioning right now because they kind of go into memory management and like efficiency. But suffice to say, they take the form of this, and then if we type the same thing, dot class, it's called symbol, and then two other ones that you will encounter and probably be quite heavily used, things called arrays and things called hashes. Now arrays are, I guess the best way to talk about them is list, which is actually what they're called in some other languages, and they are what they sound like. They are lists of things. They can be lists of primitives, so they could be a list of strings. They could be lists of mixes of those primitives. They could be lists of lists. They are basically a way of containing sets of things, and not sets in terms of mathematical sets, but some aggregation of things. And they take the form of this. 1, 2, 3, Jason and Jason. Right, so we get back a list of what we just put in, so we can see the class of that is an array. And it can take all numbers, it can take all strings, it can take any mix of them if we want. It can even take a list of lists, which is kind of contrived, but you will use that. So they are defined by using square brackets. And the final one that you will see is hashes. And hashes are described as key value. The common representation of something like that is, well, let's say something like this. So here we can see that we're creating a key of name as a symbol, and then this fancy arrow, which basically says, and the value for that is, and then we type Jason. And then we end it with another parentheses, and that's a key value pair, or a hash. You can type class on that, hash. And you can add further values to that. So you can say maybe age 28 hash, right? The important thing to note here is if we did something like this, you're not going to get, Ruby won't like you. So the keys, these things here, are unique within a hash. Now you can go crazy overboard, you can do all sorts of fancy things like ages that I have been. And you can put an array, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And that's totally legitimate. Or if you wanted to flip it around, you can have an array of hashes if you really wanted. All these things are possible. Now, that's messing around with the Ruby primitives, but we're not really capturing any of that. So we're typing it out, but we're not really saving it anywhere. And saving things in programming languages is generally done using variables. And variables are ways of assigning these primitives or other things that we are creating to something that we can then later refer to them as. So let's go ahead and save my name to, well, a variable called name. So name equals, and we're typing out a string JSON. And then we get this same return value, right? Yeah, same thing, except we've assigned that value string to variable name. So if we type name again and we press enter, we get JSON. So we've effectively captured it or saved it into that variable. And now name is what's called an instance of a string. So it responds the same way as it does up here. So if we go name.class, it will return string. Not very surprising, I hope. Same thing can be done for the fixed num primitive, for the float primitive, for symbols, arrays, all of them. And the idea is then that you can start using them in more interesting ways. So let's say that we wanted to do something really contrived, like the number 1. And we've put 1 into the number 1 as a variable. And we can have the number 2 equals 2. Now let's do some math. Don't groan, it's not that complicated. So we can do things like the number 1, if we type correctly, and then we can do what you would expect in math, which is a plus, and the number 2. Shouldn't be any surprise what the return of this is going to be, 3. If we press up arrow and change this to a minus, -1, you can do negatives in programming, not surprising, shouldn't be surprising. You can do division if you really want. Now, that's interesting. 1 divided by 2 is 0. Why? Well, because we're not using floats, we're using fixed nums. So what it's done has rounded it. So if we do something kind of magical, let's ignore for the minute, but we cast it to float. So we say, well, this number is actually a float value, which would change it to be 2.0 instead of just 2. And then we actually get a return value with what we're expecting, which is 0.5. Ruby obeys pretty much all mathematical things as it should. So you can't do things like 1 divided by 0. It's not defined in programming languages either. And that's kind of how you start working with variables. You might be thinking, well, what happens if you plus strings together? And, well, it's kind of what you'd expect. So let's say my name is Jason, and your name is Bob. And then my name plus your name. Now, you might think, oh, well, it's going to have, this or that or the other. It might try and do, like, number comparisons of the letters or something, but no, it really doesn't. It's just puts the two together. And that's called string concatenation. It's not overly complicated. You can do this types of things on like the actual numbers themselves, as opposed to assigning to a variable. The same without assigning to a variable. You can do the same on arrays, but the math there is a little bit more complicated. You can do them on symbols, I believe. In fact, let's try it out. No, you can't. Okay, well, not to worry, because we don't ever need to anyway. I learn something new every day when I'm writing Ruby, and forget probably more than I ever remember. Now, this is all well and good. We started working with variables and starting to try and put them together and start understanding how we use them. But realistically, this is kind of the foundations that you need to start building on. So let's get sort of a little bit more interesting. Now, let's say you want to represent something in real life, like a person. So we've got, you know, your name and my name, and we've kind of messed around a little bit up here with, you know, things like ages and whatever else, but we're not really grouping them in any sane way so that we can have a variable that represents an entire entity of something. So, well, in this case, a person. So some very clever people, I believe it was in the 80s, came up with something called object-oriented programming. We can argue again about whether it's great or not, or whether it causes too many issues or whatever else. It doesn't really matter, but this is one of the core things that Ruby does, and it's called having objects, or classes as they are called. So let's create a class of person so we can start representing people. So you'll type the word class with a space and with a capital P, person, and press enter. Now it's going to give us a little indented section, and what this is doing is it's saying, well, you can start typing Ruby now, or you can start typing more Ruby, and it's associated to this class person. So we're defining a class. So we're going to do a little bit of Ruby magic with attra underscore accessor. And this is basically about to say we're going to be defining the attributes that a person would have. So if you think about a person, they would have the attribute name, age, height, hair color. There's all kinds of defining features. You know, you go crazy and define every single little thing about them, but let's not do that. Let's keep it kind of simple. So let's say maybe they have a name. So here we're saying, we can see that we're using that simple thing. We use a comma. So we're saying we're declaring another attribute that they have. Let's say age. And then, let's see, hair color is a good one to go with. We're going to use American spelling for everyone out there. I am Australian, but I am lazy. So we press enter, and we're saying, okay, now a person has these three attributes: name, age, hair color. And then we finish declaring this class with end. Press enter. And it's just returned nil. So what the hell do we do with this? How does this work? Okay, so let's declare me. So we're going to have a person object or class representing me. And that's called an instance of this class, or an instance of the person class. So we create a JSON variable, as we have before, and instead of typing, you know, Bob or whatever thing like that, we're going to say person dot and then new. Now we've used this dot a few times before, and what it is it's actually another fundamental part of programming, and it's called methods. Now methods are described by my favorite Rubyist, Sandy Metz, as messages. And it's basically saying, when talking to this particular thing, person, class, or maybe string or whatever else, we want to send it a message that it would respond to. And I like that because it helps you think about, when designing methods, what the minimum viable amount of information is that you need to communicate to get back what you want. So in this case, we're actually using a Ruby inbuilt on the class person. And the inbuilt is called new. And what it says to Ruby is, give me an instance of person class. So we can actually start working with a person. So we're giving birth to a person using the new method. So if we press enter, it kind of gives us this gobbledygook. So let's sort of mess with this a little bit. So if we type JSON, now we can see we get that same gobbledygook. And as we have before, JSON.class. Now I'm hoping you guys are following along. Person, okay? So let's say that we want to start describing person. So we want to say, well, let's give them a name. And we already know the name, but how do we tell this person thing to set the name? So what we're actually going to be doing is using something that this accessor has done for us. And when I said it was describing the attributes of the class, it was kind of half true. It's also doing two other things for us. So what it gives us is a method, actually two methods per attribute on the person class, and the person class instances that look like this. Def name at name end, and def name equals. End. Now, okay, let's describe a little bit about what's happening here. So the def word is kind of like the class word. Oops, this one. It's a Ruby inbuilt, and it's called a keyword, or a special word. It's called all sorts of different things in different languages, and people tend to carry their nomenclature from their first language into other languages. But the long story short is, it's basically saying to Ruby, I want to declare a method, or as we've been talking about them as well, messages. They are called methods in Ruby, and you probably should refer to them as methods. But we are declaring a method called name, and this at name is actually saying return the value name of the instance of the class. Now, in this case, because we're not actually doing it within the person class, it's a little bit wonky and doesn't quite make sense, but that is actually what this accessor is doing for us. It's creating this method within the class person and saying return the name variable. And then the other thing that it's doing is it's creating another method called name equals, and this hopefully does what you would expect. It allows you to set the name variable to something that you supply to the method as what is called an argument, so or a parameter, depending on who you ask or talk to. So what this little brackets here is doing is saying this is a set of parameters or arguments that this method takes, and in this case it's underscore name, which will be hopefully a string, and then we're setting the at name is equal to underscore name. So that's already declared for us on person, and the same has been done for age and hair color. So if we say JSON, which is a class of person, and then we say JSON.name, it will call this method on JSON. And in this case, we're going to get shown something that Ruby does when you haven't defined something, nil. And nil is basically Ruby's representation of absolutely nothing. It has no real value, but it is incredibly useful for saying that something has no value. It will cause you many issues in your Ruby programming life when you forget to declare things or find out that something isn't declared. But suffice to say, what it's telling us is the attribute name on the class instance of person called Jason has no value. So we should set it using the other method, name equals. So Jason.name equals Jason. So we're saying this underscore name is getting this value right here, and then we press enter. And it returns Jason as a string. So now if we say Jason.name, it should be no surprise to anybody that it will return this string Jason. Cool. And if we actually look at the class, and by just typing Jason, we can see here we have @name, as we said here, as we show here, is equal to Jason. And we can go ahead and do the same thing for age and hair color. So age equals 28, I'm pretty sure that's right. Hair color equals, well, brown-ish. So if we look at Jason again, we have all of my attributes, or some of my attributes. Hopefully I have more than that. Charm and hilarity is two of them. So we'll create myself a friend to get the idea, .new, and then say bob.name equals Bob, bob.age equals 22, and bob.haircolor equals frighteningly yellow. I can't actually spell that on demand, but Bob. Now we can see, and this is very important to note, that this instance of the person class, Jason, has different attributes to this instance of the person class, Bob. And that's one of the fundamental things about classes. When you create instances of them, they are completely different and disparate from any other instances that you can create. There are times when you want them to be particularly, when you want them to be the same based on the attributes that you give it, and those are called value objects, but we won't get into those right now. Suffice to say that when you create an instance of a class, it will be different to other instances of that class. So if we did something like, oh, now's a good time to talk about equality. Jason equals, and this is Ruby's way of saying I want to do compare two things. So in this case we're kind of doing apples and oranges. We're actually saying, Ruby, can you tell me if these two things are the same? So Jason equals Bob, and what this will return to us is another primitive, false. And false is something called a Boolean. It's a type of class, a type of primitive class in Ruby that represents something that can either be true or false, or on or off, or 1 or 0. But basically it's a state of either yes or no. And they're incredibly useful things for things called conditions. So in this case, we've done a comparison between Jason and Bob and found out that they're not the same thing. Okay, so that's pretty much the sum of the kind of primitives of Ruby. We've talked about strings, we've talked about numbers, like fixed nums and floats. So strings, fixed nums, floats. We've now talked about Booleans. They actually are different classes, but they are something called Booleans. We've talked about symbols. We've talked about arrays, hashes, and our classes. And that's kind of what you need to get started with Ruby. So you could go and create a class now that was representing maybe an animal or a food type. And that's kind of where we'll leave this IRB section and start going into a text editor, because it gets a little bit boring typing this all over and over and over again. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn a little bit more about the Ruby ecosystem and how you would write a really simple Ruby app. So we can start running things as we would a Ruby application. So we'll exit out of this using exit. And I'm just going to clear my screen because I like to work with a clear screen. And what we're going to do is come to my text editor. So what you will probably want to do is create a directory where you can put these files and put your terminal on that same directory, so be in that same directory in your terminal, so you can start writing Ruby code with me. Excuse me. So we're going to write a tiny calculator Ruby app. It's a little contrived, but I think everyone understands the concept of calculators. You can add numbers, subtract them, divide them, all this kind of stuff. And we're going to do that using classes and methods, and hopefully that's pretty much the sum of it. So let's create a file. We'll delete this. We'll create a file called calculator.rb, and RB is the extension that Ruby uses. So you can press enter, blank file. Okay. So we can treat this the same as we would our IRB session. We can start typing Ruby code straight away. But the thing to note here is that it won't of course do anything. It's just a text file, and we're not doing anything with that text file. We're not executing it in any way. So we're just going to write some Ruby code. So let's see, class calculator, and now, do we want to have attributes on a calculator? What type of attributes might it have? And the answer to that is, well, it doesn't really have any attributes. So let's leave that blank for the minute. And what we're going to do is learn something about methods. So we knew that methods were messages that we can send to a class or an instance of a class, but you can actually send them to the class itself. So classes don't necessarily need to be instantiated. They can actually exist and perform actions or methods for you without actually creating new versions of them. So calculators don't really have state, or when they do, it's kind of like the memory stuff, and we will get to that later. So what we're going to do is do something. We're going to declare methods on this calculator, except they're going to be a little different. So let's start. So the first one I think that makes sense is plus. So what we're going to call it is def. We're going to type this keyword, or this special word called self dot plus. And what this is saying is, give me a method called plus on the class calculator, but not the instances of that class. So to demonstrate a little bit clearer, we create this. If I could learn to type, that would be fantastic. Self.plus. We won't bother doing anything else with it, but we can say calculator, the class, and plus. And we're calling the method plus on that calculator. But if we were to do this, create an instance of that calculator class and type plus, there's no method. So when you're creating instances of it, it won't function that way. And the point behind this is, well, there's no state that we're trying to store for a calculator, so we don't need instances of it. We don't need separate, disparate instances of this calculator. It is just an aggregate of methods that allow us to do calculations. When and if we decide to do things like memory and history and things like that, then we might need to start doing instances of the calculator. And we can get to that in a minute. So we'll clear that, exit out again. And well, plus has two things that you would supply to it. So traditionally you want to plus two numbers. And this is contrived. We can plus 3 or 4 or 5 numbers or whatever like that. Ruby actually allows you to do that, but I don't want to get too complicated. I just want to keep it to very simple things right now. So we're going to say it can take an argument of number underscore 1 and an argument of number underscore 2, and then we type end. And what we have here is a calculator class which has a method on it that takes two parameters or arguments, number 1 and number 2. But what you'll notice is right now it doesn't do anything. So if we were to type on our command prompt ruby space calculator.rb, it's going to do nothing. And that's fine. So let's make it do something at least. Let's give this method its logic, so make it actually do something. So we learned that when we were in IRB, we could do something like this. So if we were to actually save that, it's not sensible, but if we were to save that, what it would do is when we call this, it would give us back this value, which evidently is 2. And we'll run that. And what you'll notice here, or what well, let's hope that you're going to catch me on this, but it's not going to do anything because we haven't called the method, we've just declared the method. So how would you call it? Well, the same way we would in IRB. Come below it, and we just type plus. Hopefully you guys have caught me out on this as well, but it's going to complain because it needs 2 arguments when you're calling plus. So we'll give it 2 arguments, 2 and 2. And now if we run it, it doesn't output anything. Well, why not? And this is where we start learning a little bit about terminal output. So the value that it returns is not printed anywhere, so we actually want to print that out to the user. So this is a concept of command line applications. So we're going to use a Ruby method called puts, P-U-T-S. And this is a method, and it's taking this as its single argument. And if that's a little confusing to you, let's do this instead. Plus the value we added equals, and grab this. So we're assigning the output of this to this variable. And then the value we added. So we puts that out. So we're outputting that to the user or the terminal or the command line, however you want to think about that. And don't worry too much about how it knows what to do with outputting that. If you know anything about standard out, then that's how it's doing it. If you don't know anything about it, don't worry too much. Basically just understand that when you type puts and you run the command, you run the program inside of your terminal, you will get it to your terminal under almost every circumstance. So what's going to happen when we run this? We've got this class that takes 2 parameters. We're calling it plus with 2 and 2 and assigning it to the value we added. And then we're outputting that value. So let's run it. Well, it's 2 because we have 1 and 1. So how are we going to change this? We just say number 1 and number 2. So now what we should get back is 4. Pretty simple, right? It should be a no-brainer to hopefully most of you now that we can create other methods. And if we were to create other methods like subtract, we can do that. Subtract, use a minus there instead. And then we can change this code to be the value we subtracted. And then subtract, get rid of that, just comment it out. This is saying don't run this code anymore with this hash here. And then we can change the output. should return 0. Make sense? Hopefully it does. Now, I won't go and write methods for divide and multiply, although I haven't shown you the types of things that you can do. So that's multiply and that's divide. You can Google all of the different things out there, all of the operations that you can do, but it's the same as math. Keeping in mind that these are actually these are underlying, these are actually method calls. And that's kind of important to think about that. Everything is methods. So that kind of gives us a base understanding, hopefully, of how you might create a class and interact with it with class methods. So let's go and get rid of this. We'll get rid of this, and we'll go and do something with something which actually takes state. So it contains state and does something with the values using the methods that you supply. So if you were to say, well, let's use person for a good example. So we'll create class person. And what we're going to do is the same as last time, attribute accessor. So remember, this creates two methods, the getter and the setter. And we'll just use age for the moment. And we'll save that. And we will create a new person instance, me. And then we'll set my age to 28. Most of this should be familiar to you. And then we can put my age out and run code. 28. No surprise. Now, let's say that we want to make this person class mimic the real world a little bit more. So let's say that I want to have my birthday. And a method that we would call on this person class, or an action that we would want to take on this person class, would be, well, have your birthday. So it's a little contrived, but hopefully it will demonstrate to you how I could have a method on this class that functions to change the state of the class. So when you have your birthday, you traditionally get older and your age increases by 1. So we're kind of taking this plus concept and applying it, but using the state of the class, of the instance of the class. So def have birthday. And it doesn't take any arguments. It doesn't take any parameters, because remember, this instance of this class has this value already available to it. So we can do something like this. Internally, inside of this method, we can say age, because we're using the attribute reader method, which is available to us already. That, except it already exists. And we're saying age plus 1. Now, if we were to say, call that method, have birthday, we should expect, well, what should we expect? 28. And why is that? Because we're not assigning this value back into itself. So we would do this, age equals age plus 1. So what this is using is that attribute accessor of age equals, and it's also using that one in the same line. So what this is saying is take age, add 1 to it, and then add it into itself, or put it into itself, so assign that value to age. And this is totally fine and totally legitimate. It doesn't cause any kind of recursive horribleness or anything like that. All it will do is, when we run the program, well, what the hell's happened here? It's saying plus for nil class, and that doesn't make any sense. Why is that? Anybody? Alright, and with that, I'll leave you to figure it out.